Social Security provides economic security to millions of Americans, including retirees, the disabled, and survivors. It is a cornerstone of retirement security as pensions decline and savings prove insufficient. Social responsibility for the vulnerable roots in Jewish tradition, from the Torah and Mishnah. Principles like tzedakah emphasize community, compassionate giving, and mutual responsibility. Social Security manifests these timeless values, committing to...
After watching that video about the importance of Social Security in our modern civilization, one might think that we are dealing with a recent invention typical of the 20th century, born from economists and welfare states, but that's where history, as it often does, makes us uncomfortable and forces us to think more deeply. Because just when you think you've understood the essence of Judaism, a healthy discomfort arises. I often say that the Torah isn't satisfied with you simply believing correctly. It wants you to live correctly. And here begins our central conflict. And two ideas will define this entire narrative from beginning to end. After studying Berachot, after consciously reciting the Shema Israel and affirming monotheism, we discover something disconcerting. The second most important commandment is not ritualistic, it's human. Love your neighbor as yourself. Not as an emotion, not as an inspiring phrase, but as a concrete obligation. If you observe the Shema and love your neighbor, you fulfill the entire Torah. Everything. The rest is elaboration. That's why the tractate Peah is not coincidentally the second in the Mishnah. It's second because it brings faith down from heaven to earth. Peah doesn't ask what you feel for others. It asks what structures you create so that others can live with dignity. How you leave a portion of your field, how you protect those who cannot support themselves, how you transform spirituality into social policy. Loving your neighbor is not optional, it is a legal, ethical, and collective requirement. And here the bridge to the world we just saw in that video appears. The rabbis didn't limit themselves to talking about compassion. They wove together, chapter by chapter, a real, functional, surprisingly advanced system that gave rise to what we would today undoubtedly call Social Security. Nothing romantic, everything structural. We explore all of this on the Mishna TV. I, Abel Flores, will be personally answering your questions and comments, but the tension remains. If loving your neighbor is obligatory, the inevitable question is this: what happens when a society decides not to fulfill it? After understanding that loving one's neighbor is not an emotion, but a social obligation, Peah appears exactly where it should be. It is the second treatise of the Zeraim order of the Mishnah, not as an embellishment, but as a foundation. Here, the discussion is not about voluntary charity. It legislates an effective rights of the poor to a share of every harvest. It is not generosity. It is structured justice. The sages design halakhic institutions that guarantee real social protection in the land of Israel. And then the question remains open, uncomfortable, and fascinating. If it is an effective right, how is that right enforced? Listen to the tone with which the Mishnah chooses to open this treatise, because it's not accidental, it's foundational. It doesn't begin with technical details or agricultural regulations. It begins with a declaration of principles that sets the stage for everything that follows. Elu devarim she'en lahem shiur. In Hebrew, it sounds almost liturgical. These are the things that have no measure. And then the Mishnah enumerates them. Peah, the corner of the field; Bikurim, the first fruits; Re'iyah, the pilgrimage to the temple; Gemilut Chasadim, acts of kindness; and finally, Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, whose value is equivalent to all of them. This is not a decorative list. It's an ethical hierarchy. Here, the Mishnah places Peah on the same level as the highest spiritual pillars of Judaism. Now, pay attention to this, because this is where the misunderstanding often occurs. Without measure doesn't mean optional. It doesn't mean do whatever you want. It means exactly the opposite. There is a mandatory halakhic minimum, but there is no maximum that allows you to say, I fulfilled my obligation, my responsibility ends here. The Torah refuses to put a limit on generosity. It gives you a floor, but leaves the sky open. In practical terms, this first chapter defines with surgical precision how Peah works. The Torah doesn't set a maximum amount, but the sages recommend a minimum, 1/60th of the field. It's not a mystical number, it's a legal starting point. From there, ethics come into play. It's also clarified that Peah doesn't depend on a perfect geometric corner. It can be left at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of the field. The corner is the classic form, but the essential thing is not the form, but the access for the needy. And there's something else, something deeply serious. The owner must leave the peah at the time of harvest, not afterward, not whenever they remember. If the field was harvested without leaving it, the text speaks of a real transgression with consequences. This is not a belated good deed. It's a right that has been violated. It's no coincidence that this Mishnah has been incorporated into daily prayer in many traditions. Because here we are reminded every day that religious life is measured not only by what you pray, but by what you allow others to experience. Peah is not an agricultural technicality. It is theology in action. It is faith transformed into social structure. And now comes the uncomfortable question, the one this chapter intentionally leaves hanging. If the Torah allows for no limit, but the sages set a minimum, what happens when someone decides to fulfill only that minimum? Have they fulfilled the law or betrayed its spirit? After declaring that Peah has no limit, the Mishnah takes the next inevitable step. For an unlimited commandment, if not structured, becomes meaningless. And here the second chapter begins with a seemingly technical but profoundly ethical question. Is a field a single entity or is it many? The Mishnah answers with precision. A stream, a well-used path, a fallow plot, a different crop, a clearly plowed strip, all of these divide the field, not for agricultural convenience, but for social justice. Each functional agricultural unit demands its own peah. The message is clear and almost unsettling. You cannot fulfill the commandment by leaving everything in a distant corner, inaccessible to most of the poor. Love for one's neighbor must be verifiable, attainable, real, and the Mishnah forces us to ask ourselves something essential. When we fulfill our obligations, do we do so in a way that allows others to benefit, or merely to feel that we have fulfilled our duty? Now the Mishnah does something extraordinary. It takes a lofty, almost dangerously abstract idea, loving your neighbor, and subjects it to a concrete, verifiable, almost uncomfortable test. Chapter 2 of Peah doesn't ask how much love you feel. It asks something far more serious. How is your field organized? The central question seems technical, but it is profoundly moral. Is a large field a single unit? And therefore, is it sufficient to leave just one peah? Or is it divided into several units requiring a peah in each one? The Mishnah's answer is precise. The field is divided where reality dictates. A stream, a canal, a wadi, a public or private road in constant use, a fallow strip in the middle of the field, a different crop, a section clearly plowed as a separate area. All of these divide the field, not out of topographical obsession, but for something far deeper, accessibility. The law doesn't just protect the owner's intention, it protects the poor person's real ability to reach, enter, and gather. Each functional agricultural unit requires its own portion of peah. This prevents an elegant but cruel trick, formally complying by leaving everything in a remote corner, far from where most of the needy work and circulate. Here the Mishnah reveals its ethical genius. The mitzvah, commandment, must fulfill its real social function. If a physical structure renders the right inaccessible, the law is not swayed by your good intentions. It corrects them, because a right that cannot be exercised is not a right. It's mere rhetoric. Peah in this chapter ceases to be a noble idea and becomes a visible, measurable, and observable obligation. Love of neighbor no longer resides in the heart, it resides in the design of the space, in how you structure your field, in how you allow others to access it. And then the tension remains unavoidable. If the law is so precise, so concrete, so demanding, the final question is not theoretical, it is social and political. Who ensures that all of this is actually carried out? Now, the Mishnah proceeds with almost surgical precision. After defining fields and divisions, Chapter 3 poses an inevitable question for a real agricultural society. What happens when we're not talking about wheat, but about trees, vineyards, and permanent crops? There is no poetry here. There is technique. The text extends the rules of Peah to fruit trees, olive groves, fig orchards, vineyards, and other varieties that sustain entire economies. And it does so by asking precise questions. When do several trees constitute a single grove? What distance separates them into distinct units? What obstacles break the continuity for the purposes of Peah? The central criterion is not sentimental, it is visual and functional, visibility and continuity. If the trees are visible to one another, if they form a continuous agricultural unit, they are considered a single entity. If the continuity is broken by distance, by obstacles, by design, then the obligation is divided. Not because someone wishes it, but because productive reality demands it. The Mishnah also defines something crucial. Not every plant is subject to the same obligation. Those species that are harvested in bulk and stored are subject to Peah, that is, those that generate a real economic surplus. Products that are consumed immediately are excluded. The system distinguishes between occasional subsistence and structural production. This is not ideology, it is applied economics. And as expected, the text does not operate in isolation. It discusses the relationship between Peah and other agricultural obligations such as tithes, not to confuse, but to clarify. Each duty has its specific function within a coherent framework of social justice. What emerges from this chapter is clear and almost stark in its logic. The obligation of Peah adapts to economic reality without losing its rigor. It doesn't matter whether you produce grain or olives, grapes or figs. If there is significant production, there is a corresponding social responsibility. And then the inevitable tension arises, because when we enter complex terrain with ambiguous distances and debatable continuities, the question that the Mishnah intentionally leaves open emerges: what happens when there is doubt or when there is conflict about how to apply this obligation? Now the Mishnah takes a decisive turn. It stops discussing the corner of the field and delves into much more sensitive territory. What happens during the harvest itself? Chapter 4 no longer asks how much to leave, but rather what things in the very act of working legally become the property of the poor. Here, 4 technical categories appear, precise and almost unyielding in their definition. Leket, the ears of grain that fall during the harvest, not those that someone decides to give away afterward, but those that fall during the process. Shikhechah, sheaves or harvested items that are forgotten, not misplaced for a few hours, but truly forgotten outside the owner's intention. Peret, the loose grapes that detach when cutting. And Olelot, incomplete defective clusters that do not reach the full form of a marketable bunch. The Mishnah leaves no room for ambiguity. It defines how many fallen ears of grain count as leket, and when they cease to be counted, for example, if many fall together and are no longer considered an accidental loss. It establishes when a cluster is incomplete enough to fall into the Olelot category. It precisely determines when something is truly shikhechah, and at that moment something radical happens. It ceases to belong to the owner, not symbolically, legally. This point is crucial. It's not about goodwill or personal ethics. The text doesn't say, it would be right for you to give it away. It says, it no longer belongs to you. The Mishnah redefines property in real time based on social justice. It even introduces a criterion that is surprising in its realism. If something is dangerous for the poor to harvest, for example, fruit on trees that are too tall, the law can regulate it differently. Not to nullify the right, but to protect life, the system is not naive, it is responsible. This chapter forces us to understand something uncomfortable. There are moments when the Torah decides that your control over what you produce ends, even if you haven't planned it. The right of the needy intrudes upon your property, and the tension remains inevitable. If the law is so clear, so specific, what happens when the landowner disagrees with the fact that something suddenly no longer belongs to him? We now arrive at one of the most delicate and legally sophisticated chapters of the entire treatise. Chapter 5 of Peah no longer discusses how much to leave or what falls to the ground. It discusses something far more sensitive. What happens when 2 rights come into conflict, that of the field owner and that of the poor person? The Mishnah delves into extreme real-life and uncomfortable scenarios. Can the owner buy back part of the Peah, the Leket, or the shikhechah that the poor have already collected? Can the poor relinquish to the owner what, according to Jewish law, already belongs to them? The general answer is clear and restrictive. Once the donation has been transferred according to Jewish law, it is the absolute property of the poor person. It is not a loan, it is not a revocable concession, it is not a favor. The text also considers situations involving a change of ownership of the field. If someone sells their land, the new owner may be obligated to provide peah, and at the same time, the former owner, if now poor, can enter the field and collect as any other needy person. The Mishnah does not protect social status. It protects rights defined by the economic reality of the moment. The underlying principle is firm. Donations to the poor, once transferred according to the law, are not a matter for advantageous negotiations by the owner. The owner cannot pressure, induce, or manipulate to recover what is no longer theirs, except under very specific, carefully regulated conditions. There is no room here for economic cunning disguised as legality. And pay attention to the tone of the chapter. It does not appeal to pity, it does not ask for sensitivity, it establishes clear legal boundaries to protect the dignity of the poor. This dignity is expressed in a key word: property. What belongs to them must be treated like any other legitimate property within the legal system. But the Mishnah is not naive. It knows that a perfect law does not guarantee just practice. That is why it leaves a disturbing question hanging in the air, a question that resonates across generations. When the law is ignored in daily life, when economic power prevails, what then happens to this absolute property that the Torah intended to protect? During this short break in the middle of the class, we want to let you know that if you would like to make a donation, you can do so by scanning the QR code you see on the screen or by clicking the link below in the description. I personally thank you very much for your contribution. After defining with surgical precision the full ownership rights of the poor, the Mishnah takes another step, perhaps the most realistic of all. Because a just law applied in the real world inevitably generates conflict. Chapter 6 doesn't imagine ideal poor people, it imagines real people arriving at the same time, competing, pushing, and scrambling. Here, the Mishnah regulates behavior at the most sensitive moment of redistribution. It sets limits to prevent fights, violence, and humiliation. It establishes how far competition can go and where abuse begins. It even asks who can participate and who cannot. The owner, their family members, minors, nothing is left to chance. The goal is not charity, but social order. Because if justice is not organized, it descends into chaos. And the question remains, if the Mishnah anticipates these conflicts with such clarity, what awaits us in the final chapter, when the system no longer operates ideally, but under real-world pressure? Now imagine the scene, not the text, the field, the dust, the scorching sun. Several poor people arrive at the same time because they know it's harvest day. These aren't abstract ideas. They are tired bodies, quick hands, empty stomachs. And here the Mishnah demonstrates something extraordinary. It understands this scene perfectly. Chapter 6 doesn't legislate from an office. It legislates from the field. It asks what happens when several poor people gather at once, how to prevent a fight, what to do when some arrive before others, how far one can run, how much one can push, and at what point this ceases to be legitimate competition and becomes humiliation or violence. The Mishnah doesn't idealize or romanticize the poor. It recognizes that need generates tension. That's why it establishes clear limits, not to punish, but to maintain a minimal order of justice at the most fragile moment of the system, when rights are exercised under pressure. And it doesn't stop there. It also asks who else might be in the field. Can the landowner compete with the poor? Can their family members? Do minors have priority, or are they subject to restrictions? Each answer seeks the same thing: to prevent power, force, or cunning from displacing those who are already at a disadvantage. The goal isn't for everyone to be satisfied, it's something more modest and more profound. To preserve social peace at the critical moment of redistribution, that the law doesn't become a spectacle, that justice doesn't humiliate, that hunger doesn't transform the field into a battlefield. But the Mishnah, once again, doesn't end with naivete. It leaves a question hanging, almost uncomfortably. If all this is necessary to maintain a minimal order of justice, what happens when the hunger is so intense that it breaks that order? What happens when even the law is no longer enough to contain the need? Now, the Mishnah focuses on a particular case, but by no means a marginal one. Chapter 7 is dedicated exclusively to olive trees, and that already tells us something essential. In the ancient world, the olive tree was not just a tree, it was capital, it was food, light, trade, economic stability. Treating it like any other crop would have been legally irresponsible. That is why this chapter refines the law with extraordinary sensitivity. The question is not sentimental, it is economic and legal. At what point does an olive tree still belong to the owner, and from when does it become shikhechah? That is something that falls under the right of the poor. The Mishnah meticulously analyzes what it means for an olive tree to be forgotten. It is not enough that it has not yet been harvested. Specific factors are examined. How much time has passed since the last harvest? How much fruit remains? How far away that olive tree is from the rest of the field? Whether harvesting it again is reasonable or not. Here, the law does not rely on invisible intentions, but on observable indicators. And since the economic value of the olive tree is high, the discussion becomes more complex. The text records disputes between different rabbinical schools, precisely because a definition that is too broad could harm the owner, and one that is too restrictive could negate the right of the poor. Every nuance has real consequences for someone's livelihood. This chapter reveals something profound about the system. The greater the economic value, the greater the legal precision required. The Mishnah does not protect abstract interests. It tries to balance social justice and economic stability without disrupting the productive fabric. But once again, it leaves an open tension. If the right of the poor depends on something having been truly abandoned, who decides when that abandonment actually occurred? Incidentally, and as an anecdote, do you remember the chapters where the Apostle Paul or Rabbi Saul of Tarsus speaks of the cultivated olive tree and the wild olive tree that is grafted onto the cultivated olive tree? Well, guess what? By studying this chapter 7 of Peah in depth, the context from which the apostle sent to the Gentiles is speaking is revealed. But that content is part of our free Mishnah course where we study it chapter by chapter. Look for the playlist on our channel, the Mishnah TV. Up to this point, Peah has been meticulously closing the circle, without measure but obligatory, divided by functional units, extended to vineyards and trees, defining what falls and legally becomes the property of the poor. Protected as Giman full ownership way, regulated with a minimal order of justice kupah to prevent violence, and refined in the case of olive trees where the economic value demands close legal scrutiny. All of this prepares the final leap. Because chapter 8 does the decisive thing. It moves from the individual field to the organized community system. Two institutions appear that sound like an ancient form of social security. The tamchui, a daily distribution of food for travelers and the needy, and the kupah, a weekly fund for resident poor people. It includes eligibility criteria, minimum distribution amounts, poverty levels to prevent abuse, and even rules for when unclaimed food becomes ownerless and anyone can take it. It's no longer just about leaving something behind, it's about administering social justice. And here lies the crucial question. If the community organizes the law, who controls those who administer the law? Now we arrive at the culmination of the entire treatise. Up to this point, the Mishnah has guided us plot by plot, ear of grain by ear of grain, conflict by conflict. But chapter 8 does something decisive. It takes justice out of the fields and places it at the heart of the community. Here, without equivocation, is born what we would today call a social security system. The last chapter no longer speaks of individual farmers, but of mandatory institutions. Two clear, stable, organized structures emerge. The tamchui, a daily distribution of food intended for travelers and needy passers-by, and the kupah, a community charity fund administered weekly, designed for the resident poor. These are not private initiatives or spontaneous acts. They are public mechanisms sustained by the community. The Mishnah goes into details that reveal its seriousness. It defines who is entitled to receive from these institutions and who is not. It establishes mandatory minimums, how many meals a day, what special provisions for Shabbat. It introduces levels of poverty, making it clear that those with sufficient assets or income cannot take from public charity, not out of harshness, but to prevent abuse and protect the system. It even regulates what happens to what is not collected. After a certain point, for example, after the elderly poor have already taken their share, unclaimed donations become hefker, ownerless, and anyone can collect them. Nothing is left to chance. Everything has a legal framework. Here, the Mishnah reveals its most audacious vision. Social responsibility no longer depends solely on individual conscience. It becomes a communal obligation. The entire community is responsible for the sustenance of its most vulnerable members. Peah, Leket, shikhechah, and all the agricultural donations are transformed into the legal core of a stable system of social assistance. And the conclusion is not only legal, but theological, because this chapter tells us something profound about God and about society. Faith in the Creator is demonstrated not only in what one believes, but in the system one builds. When the community organizes justice, it imitates God. And so the final question is no longer historical but eternal. If this is the ideal of the Torah, how close are we today to living up to it? I invite you to continue exploring, to study with me more tractates, more chapters, more ideas that remain radically relevant today. I look forward to seeing you in the next classes, in the complete Mishnah course, and at our digital study center, lamishna.com. Because studying is not about accumulating information. It's about learning to live better. Keep watching our videos, like this class that we recommend to you now.